Have you ever experienced moments where a sudden, just intense wave of fear washes over you?
Yeah, like a feeling so powerful it makes your heart pound like crazy when your breath catches.
Exactly. Or you feel dizzy, shaking, maybe a cold sweat. Does it feel like in those moments you might actually be dying or losing control or even going, crazy?
And perhaps, really terrifyingly, these moments sometimes hit you completely out of the blue. No obvious trigger at all.
Leaving you afterwards with this horrible knot of constant worry, just dreading when the next one might strike.
Hmm. If any of that sounds familiar, if it hits home for you, then this deep dive is going to feel incredibly relevant.
Yeah, we're diving into a whole stack of source material today, all about unpacking those experiences. Panic attacks, panic disorder, and agoraphobia.
And our mission really is to cut through maybe some of the clinical jargon and pull out the most important, the most human insights from these sources to help you really understand what's going on.
And one of the most powerful ideas right up front from this material, I think, is that a panic attack at its core is actually a perfectly normal bodily fear response.
You're right, like the kind your body would gear up with if you were, facing a real danger, a lion or something. But it's happening at the wrong time.
When there's no actual danger present, that's a huge insight, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
So just to clarify the terms the sources use, they define a panic attack as this abrupt surge of intense fear or discomfort.
And it peaks really quickly, within minutes.
Exactly. Peaks within minutes, and it brings with it that whole cascade of physical symptoms and cognitive ones, too.
Okay. Now, you mentioned panic attacks. Is having one the same as panic disorder?
No, that's a really important distinction the sources make. Having an occasional panic attack is actually quite common. The sources say over 30% of people might have had one in the past year, often, linked to stress.
Okay, so that's not panic disorder then.
Right. Panic disorder involves those repeated panic attacks, plus this persistent ongoing anxiety and worry about having more attacks.
So it's the worry about the worry, almost.
Yeah, or worrying about what the attacks mean, or maybe making big changes in your life because you're trying so hard to avoid them. That's the disorder part.
Got it. And then there's agoraphobia, which often goes with it.
Often does, yes. Yeah. And it's not just like a fear of open spaces, which is a common misconception.
Right.
The sources define it as significant anxiety about or actually avoiding situations where you think you might have panic symptoms or other intense physical stuff.
And the key is situations where escape seems hard or getting help might be difficult.
Exactly that, where you feel trapped or helpless if those symptoms hit. So yeah, the two conditions, panic disorder and agoraphobia, are often very linked.
Okay. To make this feel less abstract, I know the source material has some powerful case studies.
It does. They really show how these things actually play out in real lives.
Like Matteo. He was a 31-year-old sales manager.
His first attack hit him at work. He felt dizzy, nauseous, weak, completely convinced he was having a heart attack.
Which must have been terrifying, especially as his father had recently died of one.
Exactly. And he was under a lot of work stress, too, which might have, contributed.
And it wasn't just at work, was it?
No, his attack started happening in situations where he felt trapped, as he put it.
Yeah.
But also sometimes completely unexpectedly, even waking him up from sleep.
Wow. That must lead to this constant, exhausting tension, always bracing for the next one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that worry led to widespread avoidance for him.
Right. He started avoiding being alone, shops, malls, crowds, theaters, lines, anywhere he feared having an attack and feeling trapped or embarrassed.
Yeah. And it sounds like he also developed quite a few safety behaviors, always carrying things like a Bible, gum, cigarettes, his medication.
Sort of like comfort objects or talismans?
Kinda, yeah. Things that gave him a little bit of reassurance, even if they didn't actually prevent the attacks.
Then there's Lisa, 24. Her attacks involved different symptoms.
Yeah, for her it was more dizziness, struggling for breath, chest pain, blurred vision, that feeling of a lump in her throat, and really unsettling feelings of unreality.
And her fear was different too, more about like a brain problem or losing control.
Exactly. And her experience really highlights how a specific event can sometimes kick things off.
Yeah. The sources mentioned it started after she smoked marijuana at a party.
It caused these intense feelings of unreality and dizziness, and she ended up in the ER, convinced she'd somehow permanently damaged herself or was, going insane.
And that one event had lasting consequences.
It did. She completely avoided marijuana after that, obviously, but also became deeply nervous about any chemical substance, even prescribed medications.
Wow. So her panic attacks came and went, but the worry stuck around.
Exactly. That constant background worry persisted. She felt uneasy in unfamiliar places or alone, but her avoidance wasn't as extreme as Mateo's.
And her coping strategy was different too, more about distraction.
Yeah, she tried to distract herself, just keep busy hoping to push the fears away.
And the third case, May, 41. Her situation sounded particularly severe.
It really did. A paralegal who had to quit her job because agoraphobia made it so hard to leave the house.
And her panic attacks had very strong physical symptoms. Chest pains, numbness.
Yes, strong chest pains, pressure, numbness in her left arm, shortness of breath, palpitations. Her overwhelming fear was that she was dying of a heart attack.
And like Mateo, she also had attacks waking her from sleep.
Yes, waking from deep sleep with similar feelings. And the sources mention a cultural element here too, which is interesting.
Right. Her extended Chinese family had interpretations about demons.
And her grandmother apparently reinforced this fear, saying she'd die if she didn't wake up, which you can imagine just amplified the terror.
Absolutely tragic. So that led her to fear sleep itself.
Yeah, a profound fear of sleep. She'd pace the floors at night, only managing to nap during the day if other people were around. Her whole world just shrank down to the house, basically.
Needing someone with her just to go out.
And despite tons of medical tests, cardiologists, stress tests, heart monitors, all coming back clear, she remained absolutely convinced she was about to have a heart attack or die in her sleep.
These stories really drive home how diverse the experiences can be, but also how incredibly real and physically threatening it all feels, even when doctors give the all clear.
Definitely. So let's maybe zoom out a bit and look at how the source material defines these things more formally, like using the DSM-5 diagnostic system.
Okay, so for panic disorder, it's back to those repeated episodes of intense fear or discomfort, the panic attacks themselves.
Right, coupled with that persistent anxiety or worry about the attacks continuing or their consequences or, making big life changes to avoid them.
And the panic attack itself, that abrupt, intense surge, peaks in minutes.
Loaded with physical and cognitive symptoms, the source lists a whole range like heart pounding, sweating, trembling.
Feeling short of breath, chest pain, nausea, dizziness.
Yeah, and those unsettling sensations like numbness or tingling, what they call paresthesias.
Plus the really terrifying mental ones, feeling detached from yourself or reality, derealization or depersonalization.
And fearing you're losing control, going crazy, or actually fearing you're dying. It's that whole package that makes them so overwhelming.
Yeah. And again, having one or two isn't panic disorder.
Exactly. The source stresses that the key differentiator is when the attacks themselves become the main source of worry and concern. That's when it tips into panic disorder.
Right. And there was a technical point too, wasn't there? About at least one attack being unexpected.
Yes, out of the blue. Happening without a clear trigger, maybe even while you're relaxing or asleep. That's needed for the diagnosis. Over time, though, attacks might get linked to specific situations for some people.
Okay. And then moving to agoraphobia.
The definition there really centers on that anxiety about or actively avoiding situations where you expect panic or those intense physical symptoms might hit.
And again, it's that feeling that escape would be hard or help wouldn't be around.
Precisely. That's the crucial part.
The source gave examples, like public transport, crowds.
Yeah, driving, traveling by bus or plane, waiting in lines, stores, theaters, being far from home, unfamiliar places, even things like the hairdresser or elevators.
So it's often situations where you feel kind of trapped or exposed, maybe.
Trapped or helpless, yeah. That seems to be the core feeling.
And while it often develops after panic attacks start.
Right, what they call panic disorder with agoraphobia.
The sources say it can also happen without full panic attacks.
Yeah, sometimes people experience just a few intense symptoms from the panic list, or sometimes the anxiety is driven by fear of other uncomfortable physical symptoms entirely.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
Things not on the classic panic list, like maybe certain kinds of headaches, muscle spasms, weird vision things, even digestive issues or feelings of weakness.
So it's not always the textbook panic symptoms driving the avoidance.
Not always. The core idea seems to be anxiety about any really uncomfortable physical symptoms happening in situations where you feel trapped or like you couldn't cope or get help easily.
And that's different from avoiding situations because of, say, external dangers like crime or accidents.
Exactly. The program described in the sources is specifically for fear driven by those internal uncomfortable physical symptoms and panic attacks, not external threats.
Okay, that makes sense. So this brings us to the big question, right? What actually causes all this? Why do panic, anxiety, and agoraphobia develop? The sources say it's complex.
Yeah, not fully understood, but they offer some important pieces. First, ruling out actual medical problems.
Right, because some rare conditions can cause panic-like symptoms.
Exactly. Certain thyroid issues, rare adrenal gland tumors, maybe extreme caffeine use. If you treat those, the symptoms go away. That's different from panic disorder itself.
But then there are other conditions that can coexist, like heart issues, asthma, IBS.
These can cause symptoms that feel like panic, and they can definitely exist alongside panic disorder. But the key point the sources make is that controlling these other medical issues doesn't always get rid of the panic attacks.
So the panic might need its own specific treatment, even if you're managing another condition.
Precisely. Which is why getting a medical checkup is so important, just to clarify what's contributing physically.
Okay. What about biological factors then? Is it like a brain disease or chemical imbalance?
Well, the sources are quite clear that current research doesn't really support the idea that panic attacks are caused by a biological disease as such, or that there's a specific neurochemical imbalance that's the original cause.
Even though brain activity changes during an attack.
Right. Neurochemicals are definitely involved during panic, and brain scans show differences in anxious people. But it's hard to untangle cause and effect. Is the brain activity causing the anxiety, or is the anxiety causing the brain activity? We don't fully know.
So maybe not a disease, but could there be an inherited vulnerability?
That's the idea the sources explore.
Yeah.
Some people might just be born with a nervous system that's a bit more sensitive or reactive.
Making them more prone to negative emotions generally, including anxiety and panic?
Potentially, yeah. And the sources do note that panic disorder tends to run in families. There's a higher risk, maybe 15–20%, for first-degree relatives compared to the general population.
But it's not like inheriting eye color, they stress.
No, exactly. It's inheriting a tendency or a vulnerability maybe linked to personality traits like neuroticism that just increases the chances. It doesn't guarantee anything.
And crucially, even with that vulnerability, learning can make a difference.
Yes, they emphasize that. Learning new skills and ways of responding can prevent panic from taking hold or coming back.
Okay, so biology might create a predisposition. What about psychological factors?
Huge role here, too. The sources point out that people who experience panic often develop really strong beliefs that normal physical symptoms are actually dangerous or harmful.
Like thinking a racing heart is a heart attack.
Or that feeling lightheaded means you will faint. Or a churning stomach means you'll lose control of your bowels. Or strong emotions mean you're out of control. Or those feelings of unreality mean you're genuinely losing your mind.
Where do those beliefs come from?
Well, personal experiences can shape them. Maybe growing up with parents who are overly anxious about health. Or experiencing a sudden loss, like Matteo losing his father to a heart attack. Or even just observing family members dealing with chronic illness.
So those experiences can make you more sensitive, more likely to interpret bodily sensations as signs of danger?
Exactly. But again, like the biological factors, these things increase the likelihood they don't seal your fate. Psychological vulnerability can also be offset by learning new ways of thinking and behaving.
So it sounds like the sources see vulnerability as this complex mix of biological tendencies and learned psychological factors.
Yeah, real interplay between the two seems likely.
And going back to that core idea you mentioned at the start, the panic attack being a normal fear response at the wrong time.
The sources elaborate on that. They explain the physical sensations you feel, heart racing, quick breathing, sweating, muscles tensing, are the exact same physiological responses your body would have if there was a real immediate danger. It's the fight or flight system kicking in.
It's designed for survival.
Totally normal, natural response. The problem is, it gets triggered when there's no lion in the room, so to speak.
And then the anxiety about having another attack and avoiding places.
The sources describe that as also kind of natural if you genuinely believe the attack itself or the symptoms are harmful or dangerous. It's a logical, though ultimately unhelpful, reaction to perceived threat.
What about stress? Does stress cause panic attacks?
Well, the sources say stress is often the trigger for the very first panic attack. Which makes sense, right? Stress increases physical tension. It lowers your confidence a bit.
Yeah, making situations feel harder to handle. And it often hits in your 20s, a time of big life changes and responsibilities for many.
But they're careful to say stress alone probably isn't enough. Lots of people get stressed, but they react differently. Headaches, ulcers, whatever. Stress seems to increase the likelihood primarily in people who are already vulnerable because of those biological or psychological factors we talked about.
And crucially, stress isn't usually why panic keeps going, is it?
Right. Even if it starts during a stressful time, the cycle can continue long after the stress is gone. Because the problem becomes the fear itself, and the habits you get into to avoid it.
So the program described in the sources doesn't just focus on reducing stress.
Not primarily. It focuses more on interrupting those things that keep the cycle going. The anxious thoughts, the avoidance behaviors, those are the perpetuating processes.
Okay, speaking of behaviors, the sources really zero in on some common ways people try to cope that actually backfire.
Right.
The unhelpful coping mechanisms.
Yeah, absolutely. The big one is avoidance.
Not just avoiding places, like an agoraphobia.
No, but also avoiding activities that might trigger similar physical sensations. Like avoiding coffee because it makes your heart race, or avoiding exercise, or even avoiding getting angry or excited.
Avoiding anything that mimics the symptoms of panic.
Pretty much. Avoiding certain medications, movies, hot or cold weather, being far from a hospital, even being rushed.
And while that might feel better for a second,
It gives short-term relief, yeah. But in the long run, it just feeds the anxiety. You never learn that you can handle those feelings or situations. Your world just gets smaller.
okay. What else? Distraction.
Trying to just get through difficult moments by diverting your attention. Constantly reading, blasting music, pinching yourself, snapping an elastic band, focusing really hard on something else.
Keeping the TV on all night, playing mental games.
Yeah, all that stuff. The sources call it a crutch. It might help you grit your teeth and endure something, but it doesn't fix the underlying problem.
Like putting tape on a broken table leg was the analogy.
Exactly. It doesn't strengthen the leg.
And then there are the superstitious objects, or safety signals.
Right. Specific things or people you rely on to feel safe, like always needing someone with you or carrying medication bottles, even if you don't intend to take the pills or food, religious symbols, a flashlight.
Your phone, maybe? Or specific routines?
Yeah, maybe always having your phone charged, always knowing where the exits are, needing a pet nearby. The list can be long.
And why is that unhelpful? It feels like it makes things manageable.
Well, the source explains it's another crutch. It reinforces the belief that there's something genuinely dangerous happening that you need saving from. You end up attributing your safety to the object or the person, not to your own ability to cope with the sensations.
Ah, I see. It undermines your own confidence.
Exactly. And it keeps the fear alive because you're always implicitly saying, this situation is dangerous, but I'm okay because I have my safety signal.
And a particularly dangerous one they highlight is alcohol.
Yes, very dangerous. The sources note it's a really common way people try to self-medicate, especially men. A significant chunk of people with alcohol problems apparently started by using it to try and manage anxiety or panic.
Because it works temporarily.
It provides temporary relief, sure, but it's a slippery slope. It means a dependency, needing more and more, and ironically, it often ends up increasing anxiety and depression in the long run.
So they strongly warn against that and advise seeking professional help if that's happening.
Absolutely. It's a really risky path.
Okay, so if avoidance, distractions, safety signals, and alcohol are the unhelpful ways that keep the cycle going, what do the sources say is the effective way forward?
They introduce a structured program. It's based on cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
And this isn't like traditional long-term talk therapy delving into your childhood.
Not typically, no. Unless childhood experiences are directly linked to the origin of specific panic fears, it's much more practical and skill-focused.
So what does it teach you?
It teaches concrete techniques, things like how to manage your breathing during panic, how to challenge and change those catastrophic thoughts about physical sensations, and really importantly, how to gradually and systematically face the situations and activities you've been avoiding.
That sounds like hard work, the facing fears part.
It takes effort, definitely, but it's done in a structured, manageable way. And another key part the sources emphasize is the homework.
Right, the self-study and practice between sessions.
Yeah, they say that's absolutely essential for success. You're learning new skills, and you have to practice them for them to stick.
And the big takeaway here is that this specific type of CBT is really effective.
Hugely effective. The sources state very clearly that this approach is backed by decades of research. It's considered a first-line treatment for panic disorder and agoraphobia.
So who is this kind of program right for? How would you know if it's a good fit based on what the sources say?
Well, first, you need to be experiencing those abrupt, intense episodes of fear the panic attacks.
And those attacks should include The physical symptoms and the cognitive fears we talked about, like fear of dying or losing control.
hmm And importantly, at least a couple of those attacks should have been unexpected, seemingly out of the blue.
Plus, there needs to be that ongoing worry about having more attacks or what they mean or how they're impacting your life.
Yeah, that persistent anxiety component. And crucially, you should be avoiding situations or activities because you're afraid of having panic or those intense physical symptoms. That avoidance piece is key.
Okay. And finally, the panic shouldn't be a direct result of an underlying physical condition, right? Though other conditions can coexist.
Exactly. The panic disorder itself needs to be the primary target.
What if you have panic attacks, but your main issue isn't really the fear of more attacks? Maybe it's more social anxiety or general worry or something else.
Good question. The sources suggest that if the panic itself isn't the central concern, then this specific program might not be the best first step. Other therapies might be more appropriate, and it's best to consult a professional to figure that out.
Okay. And what about doing this alongside other therapy or medication?
It's fine if you've had therapy before, but the sources generally advise against doing this specific CBT program at the same time as another therapy that also targeting your panic or anxiety.
Why is that? Too confusing.
Yeah, potentially confusing. The approaches might clash. Better to finish one or decide it's not working before starting another for the same issue. But doing this alongside, say, general supportive therapy or a therapy for a totally different problem like marital issues, that's usually fine.
And they mentioned something about evaluating effectiveness.
Yeah, they cite recommendations that psychological treatments for panic should show some signs of working within about 6 weeks or so. You shouldn't just keep going for years without seeing improvement.
Makes sense. What about
Yeah.
medication? Can you do this program if you're taking meds?
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
The sources are very clear on that.
Mm-hmm.
It's appropriate even if you're on medication, especially if you're still feeling anxious despite the meds. Sometimes meds aren't fully effective or people worry about what happens when they stop.
So this program can be combined with medication.
Yes, successfully combined.
Hmm.
And it can also help people who want to eventually reduce or come off medication, providing them with the coping skills needed.
But that has to be done carefully with a doctor.
No, absolutely. Strictly under medical supervision. You should
Wow.
never just stop psychiatric medication abruptly on your own.
Okay. So let's talk about what to actually expect from this kind of CBT program. And the big question, how effective is it really, according to the research?
Well, structurally, it's progressive. You start with the basics, understanding panic. Then you learn coping skills, breathing, thinking differently. Then comes the gradual exposure part, facing feared situations. And finally, planning for the future to maintain progress.
It's all about building those skills step by step.
And practicing them. Those homework exercises we mentioned are critical. The sources really hammer this home. Success depends heavily on doing the practice.
Is there a set timeline?
The sources suggest a possible pace, maybe certain chapters per week over, say, 10, 12 weeks. But they also stress it should be flexible and ideally guided by a professional who can tailor it to you.
And the main requirement is commitment.
Yeah, making it a priority. The sources basically say, you know how fear and avoidance might have been the priority organizing your life before? Now, learning these skills needs to take that central place. It requires dedicating time and energy.
Okay. So the effectiveness part, what does the research say?
This is the really encouraging bit. The sources cite decades of research showing remarkable success rates for this type of CBT. Typically, somewhere between 70% and 90% of people are free of panic attacks by the end of the program.
70 to 90%, that's incredibly high.
It really is. And it's not just one or two studies. These results have been found again and again all over the world.
And does it last?
That's another key point. Yes, the benefits tend to be long-lasting. Follow-up studies, looking even 5 years later, show that people generally maintain their improvements, or sometimes even continue to get better.
Why is it so lasting?
Because you're not just temporarily suppressing symptoms, you're fundamentally learning new ways to respond to your body, to your thoughts, to situations. Those skills become more natural over time. You're essentially rewiring your response.
So it equips you better for the future, too.
Exactly. You learn how to handle bumps in the road more effectively if they come up later.
And major health organizations recommend this approach.
Yes. Organizations like the National Institute of Mental Health, the American Psychiatric Association, the UK's National Health Service, they all recommend this type of CBT, often alongside or as an alternative to medication, as a primary treatment for panic disorder.
What about for the agoraphobia part?
Also very strong results. The sources mention success rates in the range of 60% to 80%, showing significant improvement, which is also typically maintained or continues to improve over time.
So what's the cost then, if it's so effective?
The main cost, according to the sources, is your time and your effort. It takes dedication, typically over those 10 to 12 weeks.
And the biggest predictor of success isn't how bad things are or how long you've had them.
No, it's not severity, duration, or age. The single most important factor, the sources say, is motivation, your commitment to doing the work, practicing the skills.
That's quite empowering, actually. It puts the control back in your hands, in a way.
It really does. It takes energy, for sure. But the argument is that it's energy spent on positive, lasting change, unlike the huge amount of energy that panic and anxiety already consume just trying to manage day-to-day life.
So, if you're not feeling motivated right now,
the sources suggest it might actually be better to wait until you are ready to really commit and make it a priority. Forcing it might not work as well.
And one last thing, finish the whole program, even if you feel better early on.
Yes, strongly recommended. Like finishing a course of antibiotics. Completing the whole thing helps consolidate the learning and gives you the best chance for long-term, robust results. They even mention using a kind of decision tree model to help you think through if now is the right time to commit.
Okay, so to sort of wrap up this deep dive into the source material, the big picture is panic attacks are basically a normal fear response, just firing at the wrong time.
And panic disorder happens when the fear of those attacks takes over, leading to constant worry, and often that avoidance pattern we see in agoraphobia, steering clear of situations where you feel trapped or helpless if symptoms hit.
And while there can be underlying vulnerabilities, maybe biological tendencies, maybe psychological beliefs learned through experience and stress can definitely be a trigger.
The sources really highlight how it's those unhelpful coping strategies, the avoidance, the distraction, relying on safety signals that often keep the whole cycle going.
But the overwhelming message, really, from reading this material is one of hope.
Absolutely. There's so much evidence built up over decades showing that effective treatments exist. Specifically, this kind of structured CBT program.
It works by teaching you practical skills to break that cycle of anxious thoughts and avoidance behaviors.
Yeah, addressing the current things that are maintaining the problem. And the success rates are high, the results are lasting.
So maybe a final thought for you to consider based on all this. If panic attacks are at their root just a natural alarm system going off incorrectly, and if the sources show that vulnerabilities can be managed and the cycle broken by learning new skills, does understanding how it all works and knowing that you can learn and practice specific ways to respond differently, does that fundamentally change how you see the challenge?
Does it shift it from feeling like some uncontrollable fate, maybe, to feeling more like a solvable problem? Something that, with the right knowledge and consistent practice, you can actually overcome.
Definitely something to reflect on the real power that learning and practice can bring, even when you're facing something as intense as fear.